So what might be the most dangerous form of narcissistic personality? You can drop it in the comments. It may not be exactly what you think. By now, you know that this whole narcissism thing is not simple. It's on a continuum. There are many subtypes. There are different pathways to how someone becomes narcissistic. It's really almost a three-dimensional kind of a thing. There are also different ways that narcissism shows up, depending on overlaps with other issues, such as addiction. Narcissism has also been found to be consistently associated with violence and aggression. And I have talked about the important study that came out by Kiervik and Bushman that consistently showed across in their study that narcissism was associated with all forms of aggression. One of the most challenging aspects of the narcissism conversation is how we have been stuck on this grandiose type for so long. The show-off, the arrogant, braggy, snobby, extroverted, charming, charismatic, selfish narcissist. Interestingly, while this type of grandiose narcissism can be dangerous, especially if folks like this don't get their way, in my opinion and in my experience, I don't think that this is where the danger lies when it comes to narcissism. In fact, some research shows that the grandiosity is almost like a strange sort of hedge or a protection against them really getting their behavior to get too dangerous. This video for me was sort of catalyzed by looking at the existing literature of linkages between narcissism and aggression, but also a passing story I had read in the news. And this was a person who was sharing the story of a family member who was killed by a former partner. And as I read this story, I recognized that I had read a story like this so many different times, except in this case, the murderer was still alive and was talking about his experience at the time of the killing. In the case, a woman was killed by a man after she said that she didn't want to marry him and she no longer wanted a romantic relationship with him. She just wanted to be friends. And she was horribly attacked and murdered and appeared to continue to be attacked after she died. The man, by all accounts, was a person that very few people even noticed when he was alive. A quiet life. People didn't really take notice of him. He didn't have a very significant career, kind of made no big splash in the world. Nothing grandiose was ever reported in this guy, nothing shiny it didn't seem. But when he was rejected, absolute horror ensued. Now, we hear a variation of this kind of a story daily in the domestic violence and domestic murder data. A person wants to leave, they make it known they want to leave, and the antagonistic, narcissistic, psychopathic, whatever person in the relationship assaults them and in some cases kills them. In the story I read, it was reactive. The woman told him she didn't want to marry him and he attacked. And in other stories, a person says they want to leave and there might be more stalking and preparation and it's more premeditated. In her case, it was a reactive thing that happened at the time she told him. And underlying all of this is often the more vulnerable form of narcissism. It's the pressure cooker narcissism, the victimized, sullen, aggrieved, angry at the world, sort of rootless, disenfranchised, disgruntled, the world owes me something, you owe me something, thin-skinned, provocable, dangerously angry, right under the surface, suspicious to the point of low-grade paranoia, but not necessarily charming, charismatic, socially successful, extroverted, occupationally successful, status-seeking, attention-seeking narcissism. There's a difference. And if you toss a little malignant narcissism on the top of that vulnerable narcissism, it is dangerous. When the guy in the news story shared his why he reacted the way he did, he talked about how he beat her because she was critical of him. And this part of the article jumped out at me. At the time of the crime, the time he committed this, leading up to that time, he was going through a bad time financially, and he said he was struggling with depression and anxiety, and he resented her not being interested in him. And then claimed that when she turned him down, that what he did was out of character, and he flew into a violent rage. I have no damned idea if this guy has narcissistic personality disorder, nor do I care. These patterns, though, are completely consistent with vulnerable narcissism. A person who is viewed as mild-mannered and down on his luck. And then, when an ego injury ensues, that rejection sensitivity kicks in, and they attack the target of that injury. In a way, because vulnerable narcissistic folks don't have the protective elements of grandiose narcissism, the success, the work that they may enjoy or are good at, social relationships, ongoing validation, again, there is more of that pressure cooker vibe. The danger is more likely. I mean, this guy apparently had not done anything like this before, and then he was sent to prison after this crime. His prison record was unclear, but it didn't seem like he engaged in violence there. A reminder that the acting out and the aggression are also sort of a form of how the narcissistic person regulates to shut down the thing that brings out the shame in them. In this case, it was the partner. And then the narcissistic person will return to baseline. Now, in this person's case, because they killed someone, there was a consequence. In many cases, there are not. Might be verbal violence, that kind of thing. Ultimately, her family suffered an unspeakable and unfixable loss. Now, the domestic violence world struggles with this all the time. Supporting people, most often women, who want to leave harmful, frightening relationships, but are too scared, frankly, sensibly so, that they're too scared to leave. People in these kinds of relationships don't really have choices, and the world stupidly and naively and ignorantly thinks that they do. But people in these relationships don't have a choice. The choice is stay and continue to be abused, but maybe protect oneself from even more escalated violence, or leave and all but guarantee even more violence. Law enforcement and justice systems don't do well with prevention or probability. They come on the scene, typically, when the crime has already been committed and it's too late. There is a, like I said, pressure cooker, powder keg feel to vulnerable narcissism. It's someone who's twisted so tight it could pop. And in my clinical practice, with rare exceptions, every client I have ever worked with where the abuse escalated to danger was managing either a vulnerable narcissistic partner or family member. The folks in grandiose narcissistic relationships, when it was an intimate relationship, the things that they were actually more thrown off by were things like by how quickly the grandiose narcissistic person would move on to a new relationship and a new life. But when it is vulnerable narcissism, again, we see this thing called rejection sensitivity and even abandonment wounds that are coupled with entitlement. And that's a dangerous mix. So when a person who has vulnerable narcissism, just rather than them crashing just into depression or sadness because they're rejected or perceive an abandonment, that entitlement comes up with a, how dare you think you can make the calls here? How dare you think you can make the decisions? How dare you think you can leave me? And then that ego wound turns into something dangerous. And while obviously in most cases, thank goodness, it will not culminate into murderous behavior, it can still escalate into severe post-separation abuse, stalking, smear campaigns, threats, threatening texts, threatening emails, and other unsettling behavior that can leave people stuck at a crossroads of, do I stay just to avoid all of that, or do I leave but then live in fear about whether I'll ever be psychologically or even physically safe? Vulnerable narcissistic patterns are much more difficult to spot because people who have more of this vulnerable narcissistic style may look anxious, depressed, irritable, but also bummed out. You may see that in them something that looks almost like a failure to launch rather than that unfettered ambition that we often see in grandiose narcissistic people. In vulnerable narcissistic folks, you might see that they're sort of stuck in a go-nowhere career, keep losing jobs. They might have few friends, unlike the more grandiose or even the communal narcissistic folks who often have larger friendship networks. They may be superficial friends, but to the world, it looks like this is somebody who's surrounded by friends. And like all forms of narcissism, there can be fluctuations. There are good days, and on those good days, you're reminded of that person you care about who sort of feels like they're down on their luck. And then, of course, you may doubt yourself about what you were really seeing on those bad days and wonder if you are being overly critical. Vulnerable narcissistic relationships also take a different kind of a toll on the person who's in the relationship, regardless of the kind of relationship. People who are in vulnerable narcissistic relationships feel lots and lots of guilt because the vulnerable narcissistic person is often not bragging or cheating, but often appears to be struggling and may also be depressed or struggling with anxiety alongside their narcissistic personality. So for people who are empathic and are in these relationships, if you're that person, you may find yourself trying to help them, feeling bad for them, feeling guilty that you keep getting sick of their behavior and they're complaining and that you just wish you didn't have to deal with them, feeling that you can't leave because they're already so down in so many areas of their lives. But then in moments when they sense that you may be slipping away, they may have also either shared threats that, for example, that they might harm themselves if you would even consider leaving them, or making obtuse threats like, you'll be sorry if you leave me. And for most people, you may not have ever clocked this as narcissism because it just doesn't look like that grandiose type. It just looks like a person who's struggling and maybe angry too. And why is it important for you to understand the narcissism piece? Because vulnerable narcissism, like all forms of narcissism, is not particularly amenable to change. And many therapists, frankly, are thrown by it. Most therapists will focus solely on the depression or the anxiety or the neurosis and miss the narcissism. And it can be an arduous experience on both sides because the narcissistic client is using therapy oftentimes as a place to just keep venting and sharing all the parts of their life where they're a victim and how nobody's nice to them. And the therapist is trying to treat their symptomatology, for example, like it's depression, and it sort of becomes this eternal, endless cycle. Now, while vulnerable narcissistic folks are more likely to get into therapy, unless that therapist really gets under the hood and works on the narcissistic stuff, their therapy may not create much change in your relationships. All of this said, this lines vulnerable narcissism up as being, in my estimation, and unexpectedly so, a more dangerous form of narcissism. You may wonder, what about malignant narcissism? Yeah, it is also dangerous, but oftentimes malignant narcissistic folks who are more prone to things like coercion, taking advantage of people, and controlling people, the dangers are obviously there at the point, if the separation, if somebody decides to leave one of these relationships. And there's so much fear in the day-to-day of these relationships. And in a malignant narcissistic relationship, the possibility of danger is always around the corner. You're not surprised by it. And as a result, people may not feel as much guilt in these relationships. So it's a different kind of stuckness. The stuck of a malignant narcissistic relationship is fear and isolation. The stuck of a vulnerable narcissistic relationship is guilt. Because with a vulnerable narcissistic person, the possibility of danger doesn't often register because there's often such a victimized, depressive feel to that personality. So people are also not as prepared. In a malignant narcissistic breakup or disconnection, people may go to greater lengths with safety plans because the dangers feel more present and real. In a vulnerable narcissistic relationship, until the time you think of disengaging or disconnecting, you may not be thinking about or concerned about escalation, so you may not be as prepared. The vast majority of narcissistic relationships do not culminate in dangerous outcomes. They end when they end. They're messy, and you heal, and they move on, and you grow, and that's typically what would happen. But compared to any other kind of personality, these relationships also carry a greater set of risks. And as you learn about it and disengage, and you may want out, it is at that point that these vulnerable narcissistic relationships can become very concerning very quickly, and you may not have been prepared for it because you never clocked it as potentially dangerous. Whenever you have concerns about safety in a relationship, any relationship, even with a family or a friend, it's important that you reach out to domestic violence programs or hotlines in your area, and we have those in the video notes too for your reference. That you talk to a therapist, you consult with other authorities like law enforcement if necessary, you document everything, you don't gaslight yourself and think that you're exaggerating. Your intuition and your body are often righter about this stuff. And it's really important that you don't listen to the people who are minimizing and gaslighting you, and trust yourself. If it doesn't feel safe, then better to be overly cautious than to take the risk. Thanks again.